Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. Now we're going to be moving on to another argument, which is called No God, No Good. And no here is spelled K-N-O-W. So no God, no good, the argument for morality. Or another interesting way you can look at it is you can say no God, no good, meaning N-O, God, and no good. So essentially what we're going to establish in this particular argument is that something that's very natural to us as human beings, morals. We're moral beings. We engage with the world with a lens of morality, right? We understand, that, or at least on a basic level, that there is good and that there is bad. And what the argument is going to suggest is that this good and bad that we understand, what we refer to as objective morality, objective moral values and duties, cannot be grounded in the absence of God. So if you deny God, then you're denying essentially moral truths. And if you acknowledge, only if you acknowledge God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can you now ground objective moral values and duties. So this is a very powerful argument, a very relevant argument that we can make to establish God's existence. So what are we going to be covering? We're going to begin by understanding some key terms. Okay, it's very important, such as objective, subjective, and etc. All of these different terms. Then we're going to look at the nature of objective morality. We'll follow this by the argument for morality, where we look at objective moral values exist because God exists. We'll establish this specific point. We'll look at some of the possible alternatives that are suggested to ground objective moral values and duties, such as biology, social consensus, moral realism, etc. Then we'll take a look at Euthyphro's dilemma. I think I'm saying that correct. Euthyphro's dilemma. It's a bit of a tongue twister, which is a dilemma, that supposed dilemma, which we'll see that doesn't sort of add up from the Islamic perspective, and we can really break and dismantle this dilemma, which basically tries to stick the theist into having to acknowledge either that God is all powerful, but morals are arbitrary, or that morals are objective, but God is not therefore all powerful. And we'll see how this dilemma is broken. Then we'll take a brief look at evolutionary moral realism. We won't go into too much detail on this. We have a forthcoming book on this, which is called The Failed Hypotheses, which should be out very soon, inshallah, which is really going to break this down. And then we'll look at the Islamic perspective on objective morality, the implications for atheism, when we've understood this argument, what does it mean for the atheist? Then we'll conclude on more of a spiritual note, understanding that who Allah is, Al-Bar, and why God is worthy of all worship, and how it links in to this specific argument. So let's begin with some terms. The very first thing I want us to appreciate and understand is that this particular argument is to do with moral ontology or meta-ethics. It's not to do with moral epistemology, how we know what is right, what we believe to be right and wrong. It's to do with the foundations, or if you like, the basis of morality. Where do morals come from? How are they grounded? That's what this particular argument is to do with. So it focuses on morality itself. It refers to the foundations, nature, and scope of moral values. It tries to answer the following questions. Does morality exist? Does objective morality exist? And what kind of value is a moral value? Where do moral values come from? Why are moral values binding? So these are the type of questions that meta-ethics or moral ontology tries to deal with or address. We also need to look at moral realism, and which basically refers to moral properties are objective. So moral realists would say moral properties are objective. In other words, mind independent. And we'll also take a look at moral anti-realism, which is the opposite, which is people would say that objective moral values and duties are not mind independent, they are mind dependent. So they are something that the subjective mind produces, right? So they'll reject moral objectivity. And we'll look at, we need to understand the distinction between these two, and then we'll go into more detail as we go through this particular section. We'll also briefly look at moral epistemology, or here in the case of understanding it, moral epistemology specifically in reference to moral ontology focuses on what is moral, right? It aims to answer the question, how do we know what is good and bad? So then this goes into different moral theories, right? As opposed to the foundations of, where do morals come from? Are they objective morals? Do they actually exist? So just to reiterate that what we're focusing on here is not a moral epistemology, as to what do we know is good and bad, because that assumes that objective moral values and duties do actually exist. But that's what we're looking at and focusing on, is moral ontology, metaethics, which is, do they exist? How are they grounded? Where do they come from? These are the questions that we are tackling in this particular section. So let me give you a really sort of morbid, strange, disturbing thought experiment for a second. Imagine you are a surgeon, right? And you do spinal cord surgeries, okay? Now, imagine you're in one of these surgeries, and for you it's a routine surgery. You do this all the time, right? It's not something new for you. And you're engaging in this very sort of delicate procedure where you're doing a spinal cord surgery on someone. And for some reason, I don't know, you get possessed or something. Let's not say possessed, right? But whatever the case is, something happens to you and you just suddenly become evil. And what you end up doing is you end up permanently damaging this individual. You cut some of the nerves of the spinal cord. Now, I know it's crazy, but would you say that this was something which was objectively evil? What you did, if you were to do such a thing, was objectively evil. It was absolutely wrong. Would you agree with that? And I'm sure you'd say yes, right? This is objectively evil and wrong. So this brings us now on to the reason I shared this with you, and hopefully you can clear your mind of such an example. It's a bit of a crazy example, right? But this brings us on to the understanding of objective moral values and duties. What do we mean when we say something is objectively wrong, right? What we're essentially saying, something objective, essentially, fundamentally, is mind independent, meaning it's not pegged on or subject to the human being, right? It's independent of our mind. So, in other words, even if everyone on the earth was to say that that was not wrong, but we know it's still wrong, right? It's objective. It's not based on the collective subjectivity of human beings or the individual subjectivity of human beings. It transcends this. It's something distinct and disjoint from the human being and his subjectivity or her subjectivity. So when we say objective, when we refer to something as objectively good or objectively bad, that's what we're referring to. It's mind independent. Morality is not dependent or based on one's mind or personal feelings, just like mathematical truth. So we know 1 + 1 is 2. 2 + 2 is 4. 4 + 4 is 8. These are objective truths. They're not mind dependent. So, even if you assume no one existed, everyone was to be wiped out of the face of this earth, 1 + 1 would still be true. It's an objective truth, right? It's not something subject to the human mind. These are metaphysical truths. Or other specific truths, observations that we make, such as the earth going around the sun. Again, if I said, well, no, the sun goes around the earth, that's incorrect. The objective truth here is that the earth goes around the sun. And again, even if everyone got together and said, no, the sun goes around the earth, we still know that the earth goes around the sun. Or even if no one existed, the earth will still continue to go around the sun. So that is an objective truth which is not mind dependent. It's mind independent. These morals are outside of ourselves, just to reiterate the point again. If these morals are outside of ourselves, the questions we need to answer are, so there's two primary questions that emerge, which are, where did they come from, firstly? Where do these objective morals come from if they are mind independent? We have to explain the origins. And what explains their objective nature? So where do they come from? Where do these objective morals come from? And what explains their objective nature? These are two important questions that we need to address and deal with. Now, someone may come around and say, well, do we have proof? Do you have proof that morals are objective? So, for example, the anti-realists, that say, there is no objective moral values and duties. Well, what's your proof for morals being mind independent? Now, the issue here, and as I've sort of briefly outlined already, the issue is a metaphysical one. This means that we have to start with first principles to make sense of our philosophical intuitions and our perceptions of phenomenon. And this is in every sphere and discipline. First principles exist in science, in mathematics, as we've seen some of the examples earlier, every discipline has first principles, metaphysical first principles. that you have to begin with. If you don't, well, then you can't move forward. Because if you start to ask the why question with first principles, you're going to end up in this bottomless pit where you just keep falling and there's no way out. You can never get to ground level where you can start to build knowledge, right? So you need first principles, which essentially you don't need to prove. They are first principles. You have to begin with them. And if you don't, well, then you can't move forward. Given our intuitions about the deliberate and unjustified snipping of a patient's spinal cord, the example we looked at, we need to ground these intuitions, right? So going back to that example of you being a surgeon and just in an evil way just snipping an innocent person's spinal cord and damaging them for the rest of their life. I mean, we know this is wrong. Every part of our being screams out, this is objectively wrong. Even if a group of people or people get together and say, yeah, it's right. Today it's right. No, it isn't. It's not subject to that group of people. It's not subject to even a collective, the human beings as a collective, as humanity. It's not subject to the mind. It's mind independent. It's still wrong. It would always be wrong. Now, these base intuitions, we have to start with that first principle that they are objective. That there is an objective reality here, that there is objective good and there's objective bad. So that is how we would address these individuals, that, well, it's the first principle. Now, if you start to deny them or question them, you're going to end up in this, if you like, infinite regress of asking this why question and trying to understand their basis and going on, and you will never be able to now live or function in this world in a objectively moral way, essentially, right? And that will be extremely detrimental if these things are suspended. Because you cannot go to someone now that does such an atrocity and say, well, that's objectively wrong. Because you will just end up saying, well, no, it's just, at best, it's my opinion. And that's highly problematic. So what we're going to do now in the next session is we're going to briefly look at the Islamic perspective, because we have different schools of creed that have had a slightly different perspective on objective moral values and duties throughout history, maybe depending on specific historical context, etc. So we're going to be nuanced here. We're going to look at those different perspectives before we move on, and that's something we're going to do in the next session. So when you're ready, move on to the next section.